Hey guys, and welcome back to another one of my Cloak and Dagger review and Easter egg videos, and today we're going to be talking the 4th episode of the 2nd season, Rabbit Hole. Alright, so this is not really my favorite cup of tea when it comes to this season of Cloak and Dagger. I'm not saying the episode was bad, it was pretty decent, but nonetheless not my favorite. Now to get started, I'd give it a 7 out of 10, even though I'm kind of conflicted. Love the arc with Tandy and Mayhem, but however, I did not like the arc with Tyrone and his mother, because it did include a couple of plots of convenience, and I'm totally opposed to those. Gonna talk about that in a moment though. But to get started, the first thing that caught my attention was Tyrone's statement.
She didn't go inside me. Okay, I don't think so. That's not how it felt.
What did it feel like?
Felt like she was being sucked through me and then put on to somewhere else.
That's basically a reference to how Tyrone's powers do work in the comics in this context, and also an explainer for how they work on the series. Now all of this means that Tyrone on the series, just like in the comics, acts as a portal. His body acts as a portal to the dark dimension, and his darkness can shroud people in the same manner that he does in the comics. In a way, it's also representative of his comic book hunger, which is not really an issue so far on the series. So far, it does not seem to be part of the series, but nonetheless, I believe it is the cool little Easter egg to just about that. But next up though is Tandy offering to be the one to go in there, rescue Mayhem, find more about the girls that are being abducted. Now for one thing, Tandy going in there, no fears, nothing, that's right out of the comics. But for another thing, I also believe this is a reference to comic book Tandy, because in the comics, she is immune to Tyrone's Shroud of Darkness, or the side effects of said Shroud of Darkness. Basically, it's her light-based powers, that does give her this immunity. Those side effects do include insanity and the possibility of a slow cold death. But heading in there, Tandy sees a Roxxon gas station. That's the first thing that she sees. Kind of her worst nightmare, and a reference to the Season 1 major villain. Now the next thing that she sees over there is rather Tyrone, a younger version of Tyrone, but he's not really Tyrone. He's basically the Loa known as Papa Legba, and Papa Legba over here is based on a Loa out of the comics, who's actually based on a Loa out of real life. Now Papa Legba himself out of the comics is basically a reference to his major appearances in the comics, which happens to be with Doctor Strange and Dr. Voodoo. And let us of course not forget that it makes a lot of sense that we see this over here, because there is a common ground between Doctor Strange within the Marvel Cinematic Universe and Tyrone Johnson over here. The fact that both of them could tap into the dark dimension. But on another note, Papa Legba is the same Loa that Tyrone was trying to summon a couple of episodes ago. The same Loa that he had a conversation about with Evita's aunt. But moving on, in a way, the episode establishes the Mayhem alter ego name, or in this case, the Mayhem name, considering one is actually Brigid and the other one is Mayhem. I always love it when these things are done in the subtle fashion, like they're not there to pick up names.
You're the toxic side. The pain, the anger. The what? Mayhem?
Now there is something a little stupid on this episode, a lot stupid actually, and it did irritate me heavily. Tyrone seems to try and put zero effort in hiding his identity on the bus. It just feels so random. One moment he's got his hood on, the next moment it is off. And for a wanted guy who's unable to tap into his powers, to get out of sight, portal, out of trouble, he's really doing a shit job. But speaking though of the fact that he cannot tap into his powers, he was about to reveal to his mother that he's got powers. He was about to port her out of the house, and the destination was probably gonna be the church, but he couldn't at that moment. Now I don't understand how they're planning to explain this on the upcoming episode, or if they're ever gonna explain it for that matter. But if they do, I think they're gonna do it in such a way that it has something to do with Tandy giving up her powers, like on a temporary basis when she went into the dark dimension. Because the moment that she started using her daggers again, that's when it worked. That's when Tyrone could basically port out and back to the church. But that, though, is the explanation that I think they're trying to give us, they're trying to present us with using these events on this episode. But nonetheless, what I really think is happening over here is they wanted to create this plot device, one that they could use in order to make sure that they don't give Tyrone's secret away to none other than his mother. So I'm thinking they're sitting there in the writer's room, okay, we created a situation in which his mother is in danger, and he's gonna try to save her, and wanting to let her know about his powers or not, he's gotta have to, like, use them if he wants to save her. It makes no sense that he's right there, he's afraid of these people, yet he's not trying to use his powers. But we still don't want him to reveal his powers to his mother, so what do we do over here? Obviously, the answer was, let's find a reason for him not to use his powers, and that's exactly what they did. And yeah, I hate it because it's a plot device, but I gotta say, it did as well parallel nicely the fact that Tandy, within the Dark Dimension, was not using her powers. Now, I hate plots of convenience, and I think this episode, when it comes to Tyrone and his mother, has been plagued with a lot of those. But anyway though, moving on, Tandy and Mayhem do find out that someone has been living in that pocket dimension, and for a while, and that person does have a badge, and Tandy does hide the badge because she knows it's Connor's and she knows that Mayhem wouldn't let it go. But we also see all those cloaks in there, the kind of thing that would tell us this is basically Connor's, the kind of thing that would confirm it, the kind of thing that would scare the hell out of this guy, because after all, Cloak was the reason he is in this pickle. I do think that even though when we meet Connors later on in the events of the episode, he's not really insane, this is a reference to the fact that on the pages of the comics, anyone shrouded with Tyrone's Shroud of Darkness, except for Tandy of course, does go insane. But the talk about girls who would be taken because they wouldn't be missed, the mention of Michaela, that's a reference to Tandy's friend from the support group, and of course in this case she wouldn't be missed because, hey, her abusive boyfriend that she always talked about and that we did see on the past couple of episodes. Now there's all the talk from Mayhem about not knowing who's behind it all, who's paying for all these ambulances. Whatever we're looking for, whoever we're looking for, he must have something to do with this place. Now I'm still hoping for Despair to be the villain over here, Despair out of the comics, the Cloak and Dagger villain in the comics, but I'm also thinking Mr. Jip is probably a villain over here. There are a lot of things you could think about over here that kind of fits the profile. The split of Mayhem, which is not by the comics, kind of fits with the YipYap, the creation of Mr. Jip. Now YipYap on the pages of the comics could split into two. One of them basically goes back to report to Mr. Jip, while the other one continues to surveil his enemies or his targets, the people with dark energy that he could feed on in order to extend his shelf life, which is already extended, because we already know that Mr. Jip has been out there for centuries. But there's a lot more to this entire thing. We know that Mr. Jip has connections to dark energy, we know that Mr. Jip has connections to the Dark Dimension on the pages of the comics. I mean, Mr. Jip was a student of the Ancient One to start with. So when you've got all this talk about monsters in the Dark Force that do feed off pain, you can't help but think of Mr. Jip and YipYap. But with all of these possibly subtle references on this episode, I'm not confirming that Mr. Jip is the villain, but nonetheless, with all of these subtle references, we've also got what might be an intentional setup for the episode. Tyrone on the run in broad daylight, while Tandy, on the other hand, is in absolute darkness. Kind of feels like a possible reference to Night and Day, like they're telling us, okay, you know what, we're throwing you breadcrumbs as to who the villain of the season is. Now this last one might mean everything, and it might mean nothing at all. It all depends on whether or not Mr. Jip ends up being the villain of the season, but I'm just trying to look at all the facts over here, all we've got, and trying to analyze the best out of them. So yeah, it might mean nothing at all. But on one hand, the premiere of the season kinda gave us the impression that Mr. Jip is possibly the villain of the season. Then the third episode kinda gave us the impression that Despair might be the villain of the season. Then came this episode and we get all the Mr. Jip stuff, but then again the series tends to create a certain level of confusion when it comes to who the major villain of the season is by asking the question, what's another word for lack of hope? Well, another word for lack of hope is Despair, and that puts Despair as a contender for the position of villain of the season. Despair is also still very much suited to be the villain of the season, feeding off the lack of hope of people, feeding off their despair. But speaking of the idea of day and night, on one of the trailers or the teasers for this season, we did see Tyrone in a white cloak. Now back then I did think of this as, the Mr. Negative effect, switching the source of their powers. He gets his powers from the light force and she gets her powers from the dark force. But on this episode, it's not just the idea of day and night, it's not just that he's operating in broad daylight and she's operating in total darkness, but we've also got the idea of two sides of one and the same coin. So Mr. Negative or not, that might explain why Tyrone at some point this season is going to end up using a white cloak, while Tandy, who seems to be slowly falling under the spell of Mayhem. Not saying that Mayhem is bad over here, I mean she has a good objective, but nonetheless she's falling under the darker spell of mayhem, and hence might end up being the darker one in this equation. But in all cases, and even if the endgame of this season is not all about them switching the source of their powers, the two sides to one coin might just be a reference to just about that, right out of the comics. But finally though, and before the episode was over, we had Connors back in the real world and out of the dark dimension, which means that Tyrone has got a way out of the crime that he allegedly committed, you know, the murder of Connors. That being said though, my work here is done, so let me know in the comments down below what you thought of this episode. Let me know if there are any other Easter eggs that I might have missed on this episode. Let me know as well if you did like this video by dropping it a much appreciated like, subscribing to this channel, and enabling notifications for my future videos, community posts, and live streams. But until the next time that you tune in for another one of my videos, Cloak and Dagger or otherwise, thank you so much for tuning in to this review, and have a great day.